So greetings and welcome everyone to Sonic Legacies, Ludwig Koch and the Sound of the Environment. And thank you for joining us for this first event organised by the MeCCSA Sound Studies Network. My name's Andy Birtwistle and I'm currently the chair of the network, and with my colleague Dr. Levack, I'll be running tonight's session. Before I introduce our first speaker, there are a few organisational and housekeeping type things that I want to say about tonight's event. We would ask everyone to switch off their microphones during the presentations, and just to let you know that this session is being recorded, so if you prefer not to be recorded, please ensure that your microphone and that your camera are turned off for the duration of the event. Our thanks, first of all, to MeCCSA, the Media, Communication and Cultural Studies Association, for supporting the network and tonight's event, and of course to our three fantastic speakers this evening, who are the filmmaker, Anthea Kennedy, John Levack Drever, Professor of Acoustic Ecology and Sound Art at Goldsmiths, University of London, and Cheryl Tipp, Curator of Wildlife and Environmental Sounds at the British Library. Unfortunately, Cheryl couldn't be with us tonight, so she's recorded her presentation, which we'll see later. Each presentation will last about 20 minutes, and these will be followed by a Q&A session, which will be chaired by Philippa. If you have a question for Anthea or John, you can either raise your virtual hand during the Q&A session, and you'll be invited to then turn on your microphone and ask your question, or you can use the chat function, and Philippa will select some of the questions in the chat to read out to our two presenters. Okay, so Ludwig Koch is a well-known figure within the history of British broadcasting, a pioneer of wildlife sound recording and natural history programming. But what we wanted to do in this event tonight is to look at Koch's career more broadly, and in particular to think about his relationship to histories of acoustic ecology and soundscape composition. As well as recording wildlife in the 1930s, Koch was producing records of urban soundscapes. So while in his later career he may have focused on wildlife sound recording and birds in particular, he was also interested in the sonic environment more broadly. And during the 1940s, we know that he was experimenting with soundscape composition. And tonight we'll get a chance to hear a recently discovered recording of Koch's Symphony in V, produced for the BBC in 1942. And it's actually a piece which only gets one single line in his autobiography, Memoirs of a Birdman, which was published in 1955. So tonight's event aims to explore some of Koch's overlooked contributions to the development of acoustic ecology and soundscape composition, and hopefully to offer some new perspectives on his work. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who's Anthea Kennedy, whose experimental film Birdman, made in 1975, has been screened online as part of this event. So Anthea studied fine art at Chelsea School of Art and Leeds Polytechnic here in the UK, and film at the Royal College of Art. She's also worked as an editor for filmmaker Stephen Dwoskin, amongst others, and has taught filmmaking at various art schools and universities in the UK. She's also the granddaughter of Ludwig Koch, and Anthea's currently working on a new film on Koch's life and work. So I'm going to hand over now to Anthea.
Thank you, Andy. I'll just try and make my PowerPoint work. Is that okay? Can you see that? Okay. So Ludwig Koch is primarily known for his recordings of birdsong, but my talk this evening will focus on his lesser-known soundscape work, as well as aspects of his biography. Koch, born in Frankfurt am Main in 1881, was brought up surrounded by music and animals. He had a small zoo in his house. He also had an enthusiasm for mechanical objects, phonographs, gramophones, musical boxes, and clocks. It's not surprising that these early influences and interests developed into a career, first as a musician and then as a recordist of birds, animals, and many other sounds. Although his life was ruptured by the Nazis, it was still rich and varied. His achievements are many. As a child, Koch learnt the violin and moved in musical circles. He met Clara Schumann and Franz Liszt, for example. He studied singing and performed professionally as an opera singer until the outbreak of World War I. During that war, he worked in intelligence as he spoke excellent French. He continued governmental work until 1925, resigning because none of his colleagues would take seriously the rise of Hitler and National Socialism. He then worked for Frankfurt City Council, for whom he organized exhibitions. This is a music exhibition that he organized in 1927, which had 400 concerts. And guests included eminent politicians and musicians from all over the world. One guest was Leon Theremin, inventor of the theremin, and another was Anatol Lunacharsky, who was Minister of Education and Arts from the Soviet Republic. So on the back of the success of this exhibition, Koch was offered a post in Berlin as cultural director of Carl Lindström, a record company affiliated to EMI, and also the creator of the Parlophone record label. Koch was responsible for producing educational records, and he also made his own recordings. He devised the sound book, a multimedia object with text, photographs, and records. During his 8 years at Carl Lindström, he produced 11 such books on music, wildlife, and other topics. So here you can see 2000 Years of Music, which he made with a musicologist, Kurt Sachs. Schrei der Steppe, which he made with Lutz Heck, who was head of the Berlin Zoo, and Gefiederte Meistersänger, which he made in 1935 with Oskar Heinroth, who was head of the Berlin Aquarium, but also an ornithologist. And that soundbook contains 25 recordings of birds. He also edited a small monthly magazine called Kultur und Schallplatte, Culture and Records. So here's the front and back cover. The back cover is a photo montage of the Carl Lindström building and factory where they produced records. A quote from one of his articles in this magazine expresses his views on the importance of recorded sound. Quote, "Educators of all countries, enter into an exchange of the cultural goods of your nations. Create international record archives in your schools and educational institutions so that you can give the next generation information about the culture of all times and of all peoples. We need citizens of the world." End quote. When the Nazis took power in 1933, Koch's internationalist ideas were stifled, and Carl Lindström, as an important media company, was quickly Nazified. In spite of his Jewish heritage, Koch continued to work there for 3 more years. He had several dreadful encounters with Nazi authorities and was denounced at least twice by colleagues at the company. His work had to fit the politics of the day. Thus, he produced 2 little-known soundbooks of recordings of the Army and the Navy. This one is of the Army. The Navy one has a very similar cover, and the other picture shows the record sleeve and a list of the contents. Each individual track is a soundscape in its own right, containing, for example, sounds of a military maneuver, drill, military bands, engine room noise on a ship, sailors relaxing and singing, and so on. He made 2 soundbooks of German cities, Cologne and Leipzig. Whilst these contain the obligatory Nazi speeches, Koch was also able to include his recordings of the sirens of the Leipzig fire brigade, printing presses, markets, station atmospheres, an orchestral rehearsal, and so on. He also recorded the sound of organs played on by Bach and Mendelssohn, and 2 18th century flute clocks that played compositions by Haydn. His work in this area has led him to be described as a keeper of sound monuments. In January 36, Koch went to Switzerland on a lecture tour to promote his work. So on the left there's a sort of calling card showing that he was based in this Kramhof Konzertsaal in Zurich, and on the right is a flyer for a lecture he gave at Neuchâtel. So whilst he was in Switzerland, he learned that there was a warrant out for his arrest in Germany, and so he never returned home to Berlin. Although he would have preferred to go to France, where he had family, he was advised that England would be the best place to continue his work recording birdsong. Thus, in February 36, he arrived as a refugee in London with little money or possessions. One of the great sorrows of his life was the fact that he had to leave behind in Berlin a vast record collection, as well as 400 wax cylinders on which were the voices of many famous people of the time. In London, he did manage to build up some contacts, enabling him to produce several animal and bird soundbooks in the UK before the outbreak of World War II. So this is Songs of Wild Birds, which he produced in 1936, and there was a second record called More Songs of Wild Birds, a soundbook produced in 1937. In 1940, Koch was interned on the Isle of Man as an enemy alien. He was considered suspicious due to his work in German intelligence during World War I, although at the same time his recordings were being played by the BBC. In 1941, Koch joined the European service of the BBC and transferred to the Home Service in 1942. He was employed to record effects, which he did with great enthusiasm. He recorded in factories, on farms, at St Paul's Cathedral, Petticoat Lane, Covent Garden Market, and on London Transport. So this is a letter giving him permission to record at Baker Street Station. He was full of ideas for sound pictures, or sound paintings as he called his work, and for programs and soundbooks using the sounds he'd recorded. Whilst admiring the quality of his work, the BBC director of recorded programs appeared exasperated with him and his constant ideas for new developments. Koch's contract with the BBC came to an end in March 1943. Any thoughts of an extension were stymied by an article in the Observer newspaper, written by one of the founders of the mass observation movement and radio critic, Tom Harrison. The article begins by heavily criticising the BBC for their insensitivity towards sound. Following this is a paragraph in praise of Koch's work, urging the high-ups at the BBC to take more notice of his output and to listen to his, quote, sweet babbling brook, his dying bumblebee, the terrifying symphony of steel, and the clever Victory V, the strange chaos of his regiment drilling, and beautiful dawn chorus of birds. Listening to these unused records, one hears a whole new area of radio reality, end quote. Although Koch left the BBC shortly after the publication of this article, he did have a successful freelance career with them. They re-employed him in 1948, but forced him to retire 2 years later at the age of 69. In his Observer article, Tom Harrison mentions 2 of Koch's soundscapes, Symphony in Steel and Victory V, which we'll hear in a minute. Symphony in Steel has not been traced, but Koch's notes for it do exist. This is just one page of them. There's about 6 or 7. So working on it late into the night during February and March 1942, he described it as an experiment. Maybe it began with a factory siren, followed by sounds of a steel foundry, guillotines, riveters, steel cutters, circular saws. There were pitch changes and, most surprising of all, extracts of the dance pieces, Powerhouse and Toy Trumpet, written by Raymond Scott and played by Ambrose and his orchestra. Also included were sounds from the largest power plant in Europe, the Dnieper Dam in Ukraine. Other soundscapes by Koch, which I've found out about, are one called Thick with Corn, made in 1942, described in the Star newspaper as, quote, a topical sound picture of wartime harvesting in which the incidental music is the swish of scythes, the roar of tractors and threshing machines, soldiers on the roads, children coming out of school, sparrows chirping, skylarks singing, geese cackling, and cows coming home, end quote. And also another soundscape for a program about machines called Masters or Slaves, recorded in Birmingham in 1945. Koch can be seen here in his famous black beret. This incorporated a special tram journey across Birmingham where the microphone was placed under the tram. Koch's sound picture, Music of the Sea, and his recordings of the sounds of Paris, broadcast on the third programme in 1951 and 52 respectively, still exist and can be heard at the British Library. So now for Victory V, or Symphony in V, made in 1942. Koch described it thus, quote, the signature tune of the European section of the BBC was the phrase at the beginning of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and I produced a program called The Victory Symphony, in which every sound was based on this phrase. Even nature helped me, for one of the call notes of the curlew has this victory rhythm, end quote. So we're going to hear that now, and this might be the first time the piece has been played in public since 1942. And I'd like to thank Sean Street and Julian May for helping me to find it in the BBC Sound Archive. And the script you can see on screen is actually a different version from the one you're going to hear, as the one you're going to hear doesn't have the narration that's in the script. Okay, so you could hear that now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anthea. And now I'd like to introduce our second speaker. So John Levack Drever is Professor of Acoustic, Ecology and Sound Art at Goldsmiths, University of London, where he's co-head of the Unit for Sound Practice Research. His research operates at the intersections of sonic arts, sound design, soundscape studies, urbanism, and environmental acoustics. He was a co-founder of the UK and Ireland Soundscape community and was its chair for many years and continues to be a director. From 1998 to 2018, he was on the board of the World Forum for Acoustic Ecology. And John's a member of the Academy of Urbanism and also of the Institute of Acoustics and the Audio Engineering Society. John, over to you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it's good.
Yep, good. You can see. Excellent. Oh, gosh, I mean, follow that. That was extraordinary. And I hadn't heard that before. And it should be, so thank you, Anthea. It should be in every, I wish I could include it in my courses if it's available. So what I'm going to talk about is just to kind of place Ludwig Koch a bit in a kind of UK, or well, in a kind of a context of field recording, primarily from the UK, but some other work as well. But also kind of from my own perspective, because when I did my PhD back in the late 90s, I didn't know about Koch's work, and it was actually only until I had finished my PhD and was working on a soundscape project exploring the sounds of Dartmoor, I came across, where is it, Memoirs of a Birdman, and blimey, it was extraordinary. There was Koch talking about recording on Dartmoor and struggling with traffic noise and wind and all the kind of things I was struggling with.
John, I think you've muted yourself. Yeah, you're back in. That's great.
Sorry, I've been teaching all year in Teams and I still haven't got used to it. Yeah, so Koch was discovering Koch was a real revelation to me, because I, coming from sonic arts and more experimental music and acoustic music, I was aware of kind of other traditions. And here's a kind of list of things I was aware of. Of course, the World Soundscape Project, led by Murray Schafer, doing projects in the early 70s. The amazing Luc Ferrari, within the context of musique concrète, doing field recording of his famous prefigure, also in the kind of late 60s, early 70s, which was quite a it was really a revolutionary work within that context at the time. Wendy Carlos's use of field recordings and sonic seasonings, and Bernie Krause's work. The first stage he started to use field recordings. So this was all happening in the early 70s. And some of these characters make a point of saying they were pioneers. They were the first people to do kind of interesting experimental things with field recording, and I just knew that wasn't true. And of course, Koch immediately is evidence to that. So in this talk, I want to kind of cover a few things, a few other pioneers and areas worth thinking about. And of course, we can go back to Edison's original writing about the phonograph in the late 1878 year. So it's not just about music. It's many more things. He has so many ideas here. And of course, all of these have come true. It's stenograph, it's elocution tools, it's recording members of the family, it's recording political speeches, it's about learning languages, it's about speaking clocks, all kinds of things. And of course, at the time, Edison is selling this device as some kind of fidelity, some way of kind of capturing reality. And we see this, of course, with the famous image of his master's voice. And I want to remind you, some of you will know this, but Nipper the dog, do you know what Nipper the dog is standing on? Or he's not standing, he's sitting. Do you know what he's sitting on? He's sitting on a coffin, the coffin of his owner. And so there's a very strong sense of kind of fidelity there. There's a great book here. I'm going to show, I don't know if you can see it. I hope you can see me. There's a great book called The Guinness Book of Recorded Sound, which I got many years ago, and in it is the first recorded example of someone died making a field recording, which slightly weirdly I got excited about, because of course many people have died in the efforts of making photographs in wartime, etc. But here was the story about someone making a field recording, and the story goes it's William Gaisberg, brother of the famous Gaisberg, who did lots of music recording, and the story goes he went to the Western Front and recorded a gas shell bombardment, and apparently died a short time afterwards. And it's sold as being an actual recording. And you'll find online people talk about it being an actual recording, but of course the experts, the forensic experts, have said that the whole thing was staged actually and put together. When you hear the banging sounds, it's actually timpani, etc., which is a bit of a disappointment, because I got very excited when I came across this. Because for me, recording sound is important. It's just as important as recording images. Another important historical example that many of you will know about is Beatrice Harrison playing her cello when she realised that the nightingale sang in her garden in Surrey. And there she is. It became the first, I understand, one of the first outside live broadcasts on UK radio, and then was recorded in 1927. You could think that it was faked, but I do, again, I think on this occasion it was real. But anyway, the experts might need to get into double check about that, whether the nightingales were mixed in later on the recording. But it sounds pretty convincing to me. And this tunes into the kind of rich tradition of wildlife sound recording that Koch so importantly developed in the UK. I want to talk to you a little bit about a project I got obsessed with. Here's another record, because I started to collect records and to look around and try to explore this territory much more. And I came across this one. So it's Columbia Records, and it's called London Street Noises. And it's from 1928. On one side is the recording of Leicester Square, the other side is Beecham Place. And it says there, recorded in conjunction with the Daily Mail, explanations by Commander Daniel. And we hear Commander Daniel talking throughout the recordings. What's fantastic is he tells us exactly the date and the time of the recording and the location, and he gives us a commentary about the sounds. So I did a bit of research into this recording. The first question was, who is Commander Daniel? So I did a bit of research, bought a few books, and here he is. He'd just been court-martialed by the Navy. It's a long story. I could tell you another time, but it's to do with this the Royal Oak Affair, involving a band not playing the right music and an admiral coming on board the ship and being rude to the band, and Commander Daniel as the captain, and also he was the commander, but also the captain of the ship got angry with this admiral, and they wrote a letter to the Admiralty and spoke to the officers, and then they were court-martialed. Anyway, the Daily Mail uses that kind of as a, they really championed Commander Daniel through this court-martial, and they hired him once he'd been fired to work for the Daily Mail, and he ended up leading a project about sound recording around the streets of London. Did a bit more recording, and going through the Daily Mail at the time, found lots and lots of articles about it. It was a campaign against traffic noise. Now this predates decibels, so it was about the effect on noise on your nerves. Of course, it's after the First World War, so there's an understanding of shell shock at the time. And every day it showed a different photograph of the location, the microphones, the kit. The kit was, of course, hugely complex because you had to install the equipment, heat up the discs to the right temperature. Very, very complex. And here it is all in the Daily Mail. Really, really exciting to discover this because it had been forgotten about. And even more exciting was we found a box of discs in the Museum of London, which they allowed us to digitize. And beyond the two recordings, the two sides of this disc here, there was multiple recordings made across London. So we've got a really interesting kind of snapshot of city sounds from 1928. Here's me being a bit of a geek. Back in 2008, I went to Beecham Place to record at exactly the same time and date as the recording was made on the 80th anniversary. And then again in 2018, it was the 90th anniversary, and by that time I'd actually managed to work at exactly the right location. There's me looking a bit bolder, but very happy because I'm at exactly the right location at exactly the same time, 90 years on, recording those sounds with some lovely people who were joining me. You can see some links there, and email me. I can send you these links because I've put these recordings online, and I went back there during lockdown, which is very interesting because of course there was no traffic at all. Even between 2008, of course, and 2018, there's a huge change in traffic, such as the change of diesel engines. Amazingly, I was going through Virginia Woolf's Room of One's Own, and here's an account from October, a little bit later, from 1928, as she steps out of her house in Bloomsbury, doing a kind of listening experiment. Extraordinary. So it's not just, of course, in recorded sound, we find lots of interesting accounts of listening and soundscapes in literature. And Virginia Woolf, a particularly interesting one, very acute listener, probably had some kind of level of kind of hyper acute hearing. Very interesting. What other traditions are there? Well, there's the tradition of sound effects that go right back to the beginning of gramophone records. And I've got obsessed with recording these. I've got to stop buying them, but I find them so interesting. I took a photograph earlier of one in my room here called Storm at Sea. I mean, a recording of waves back in the 1930s. And there's a great book by Frank Napier from that era, which talks about these recordings. So you get a sense of how useful or how useful they weren't. In a bit of other research for some of the work I was doing, I came across the first example actually of using gramophone records in theatre. It goes back to the 1890s in a play called The Judge by Arthur Lowe, where they needed a baby crying, and instead of actually having a crying baby at the side of stage, which would have been maybe a bit tricky. They recorded one of the production members' babies crying, so that was played at the side of the stage. What I find really interesting about sound effects from this era is that some of them are field recordings, location recordings of an activity, a thing that they hope that it represents, and some become much more like sound effects, which are much more about communicating, a kind of shorthand, communicating something particular. And there's an interesting kind of discussion there about the difference between a sound effect and a soundscape. They're not the same thing. Soundscapes often don't communicate very well the place, the location, the activity going on. It's quite an interesting discussion there. Another huge discovery for me, sorry, everyone knows about this, but coming from music, I didn't know about Humphrey Jennings and the influence of Cavalcanti. Many of you media people had, this is your bread and butter, but I didn't. And hearing places like Spare Time and Listen to Britain, when I was starting to explore this world, were so exciting for me because they were much closer to the kind of the aesthetic, the kind of thing I was exploring. And gosh, it's quite amazing hearing that piece, the Victory piece by Ludwig Koch there. Interesting connections with Listen to Britain, I think. There's a bit of research to be done there, but very interesting similarities. I wonder I can't remember the year of Listen to Britain. Around the same time as before America joined the war. Listen to Britain and Spare Time are really interesting because the image is cut to the sound, so location sound is really, really important. And again, we've got a connection with mass observation through Humphrey Jennings. So there's some interesting history connecting here. So I'm very excited. I got to know this wonderful gentleman, John Gray, and he even did a workshop for my students one, which was great fun. And I interviewed him, which you can find on SoundCloud. John Gray, when I met him, got to know him. He was quite elderly, but it turned out he was the person who put the mics in the right place, in the right location for Humphrey Jennings on documentary films like Spare Time, when using sound within a documentary film was completely new. It was a new thing. They didn't know how to do it. And Cavalcanti, John Gray told me, actually sent him off to really think about how to use recordings in documentary film. And he sent him off to the National Gallery to look at the paintings. And apparently the instruction was, do the same thing. So it was just amazing to meet someone who'd been there at the birth and really thinking about, how do you do this with documentary sound? You can't, it's not like the modern day today where we have amazing digital cameras which have great sound. You just press record. Here you have to be much, much, much more creative. Another kind of parallel history is in all of this is the history of train recordings. And here's a great book by Peter Hanford. And you can buy lots of lovely steam train recordings. So it's not just about wildlife sound, particularly bird sound, which is a kind of a great tradition after Ludwig Koch and Eric Sims and people who follow him. But there's a big tradition of recording steam trains. Interesting, I think, it goes back to the dawn of musique concrète, of Pierre Schaeffer's Etudes Chemin de Fer, maybe the birth of cinema itself, of the use of trains there. Another important person in this history is Tony Schwartz, because one of the problems is the kit. The kit is not mobile. It's huge. It's complex. You have to heat it up. Tony Schwartz was aware of the possible technologies of mobile technology, and he was the first person. He actually hired someone to make him a mobile tape recorder. So he was one of the first people to go out. He was working in public radio, doing wonderful radio works in New York, lovely cut-ups. Here's a nice piece worth exploring called Standing Here at the Present Time. A certain portrait of New York with lots of hard juxtapositions of environmental sound and talks about race and identity in very hard cut ways. Fascinating work, really, really interesting. And then this opens up to a kind of another exciting history, which is the dawn of amateur tape recording clubs, which I didn't know about. And gosh, how exciting. They're in the 1960s. Well, I should say I did know a bit about this because my father back in the early 60s was doing sound recording. He was a doctor, but he had bought a Grundig tape recorder and was rushing around. He was recording things like the last Glasgow tram, and when he went to do his national service in Hong Kong, took his recording kit with him. And that's pretty typical. So there's a huge history of amateur tape recording and tape recording clubs throughout the UK and internationally. It's not all men. There are some women in that picture there. There's a lovely story actually in one of these clubs about they've just visited Daphne Orum's studio there, which is really nice to see at that time. Yeah, and they're also selling kit all the time, but they're also searching for, like, you know, sound hunter clubs, which actually sounds quite contemporary. But back in the 60s, there's really an exciting idea about kind of sound hunting. So it's another, you know, really interesting history. The technology becomes cheap, it becomes mobile, and suddenly lots of people are doing sound recording, a bit like today. And then we get up to today, and of course there's other histories, and I wanted to include this slide of this really interesting book by Biritra Chaturvedi called Between the Headphones. So here he's been interviewing people who do sound recording for Indian cinema. Such an interesting history to kind of learn about, which needs to be done, so we can learn about these other traditions, which is, you know, really exciting as the kind of field opens up. So that's really my slides now. So, you know, it's just interesting to kind of share this moment. Very exciting to hear the Ludwig Koch stuff, and really interesting to learn about those other works. I mean, I've been doing my best to kind of buy the different recordings that are available on eBay. I've got a bit of a collection, spent a bit of money. Here's my favorite item. I don't know if you can see this or see me, but this is Animal Language. Great when he goes to London Zoo and Whipsnade Museum with Julian Huxley. But it's a signed copy, and this copy was a present to Daphne du Maurier from Ludwig Koch. There you go. So that's my favorite thing. So that, I think that's me really, but really exciting to learn more about Ludwig Koch, and I hope we have a chance to hear more of those recordings. I was seeing pictures there of work that I've never heard of before, and it's so interesting to know that how experimental he was. I mean, that piece we just heard there also reminds me of another important historic example, which is Walter Ruttmann's Wochenende, which has maybe more of a kind of surrealist take to it. So I wonder what knowledge Koch had of Ruttmann. Maybe did they know each other? There's a question to ask. Anyway, so that's me. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, John.
Hello.
Okay, thank you. Right, and now we move on to our third speaker tonight. So Cheryl Tipp is the British Library's curator of wildlife and environmental sounds. With a background in zoology and library services, Cheryl has spent the past 15 years looking after the library's world-renowned collection of 300,000 species and habitat recordings. She's worked extensively on projects that encourage the creative reuse of archival content, from student video games to short films from emerging filmmakers, and has written widely on the history of wildlife sound recording. So, as I said, Cheryl can't be with us tonight, but she's recorded a video for us, which we'll go to now.
Hi everyone, my name is Cheryl Tipp and I'm curator of wildlife and environmental sounds at the British Library. I'm really sorry I couldn't be with you tonight for this wonderful event, but what I've done is I've recorded the presentation I was supposed to give to you, and I'm going to launch it now. Let's see, and hope that it works. I should be used to this by now, shouldn't I? So here we go. Seems to have worked. So the title of my presentation is Ludwig Koch and the Sounds of Nature. And what we're going to be looking at is, you see, the legacy of Ludwig Koch and the material of his that we hold at the British Library, some of which is online and some of which you can consult if you come to the library. So just to give you a little bit of context, the British Library Sound Archive was formed in 1955 as the British Institute of Recorded Sound, joined the British Library in 1983, and today it has somewhere in the region of 6.5 million sounds. It's very difficult to give you an accurate number because the collection is continually growing. Some things are accession, some things are not. You know, it's very much a fluid collection. So 6.5, 7 million is a good number. We cover all kinds of sounds, so music, spoken word, radio, wildlife, soundscapes, some natural, some urban, a variety of content. But I look after the wildlife and soundscapes content. So the Wildlife and Environmental Sounds collection was formed in 1969. We've got over 250,000 catalogued wildlife and environmental recordings, most of which are unpublished and unique to the library. Again, this number is changing all the time. We've got a couple of cataloguers working on a digitization project, and so the numbers are going up every single day. But it's a good ballpark, 250 to 300,000 recordings. We cover all the animal groups. So we have birds, mammals, fish, reptiles, amphibians, invertebrates. We have natural habitats, environmental sounds, so weather and water, also mechanical sounds as well, so trains and planes and equipment and that kind of thing. And it's the only publicly accessible collection of its kind in the UK. Now we're here to talk about Ludwig Koch though, aren't we? So what we're going to do now is just take a look at both him and the material that we hold in the library and his legacy, really. I mean, he's the father of wildlife sound recording. He broke so many barriers and overcame so many obstacles in order to get those wildlife sound recordings, put a process in place, and then share them with the public. So it's not only the technical aspect that's part of his legacy, but it's also the way that he shared those recordings with the public, and fostered that kind of that love of wildlife and wildlife sounds, but using sound. So we have a variety of things. We have his published records, which is part of our published collection because we collect published material as well. We have test records as well. So these are where he would go out into the field, record a particular species, make several recordings, bring them back to the studio, press them, and then select the best recordings out of that bunch and use them for published records or radio broadcasts or talks or what, however he wanted to use them. We also have his autobiography, which is pretty hard to come by now, Memoirs of a Birdman, and it's just brilliant. I mean, I've used it so many times. It's such a rich resource, and it's great understanding his process, and the trials and tribulations of being a wildlife sound recordist in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, and just trying to find ways in which to tackle all of the problems that present themselves when trying to record wildlife, particularly in those days when the equipment was so heavy and tricky. It's not like today. So if you ever get the chance to read it, I highly recommend it. We also have his personal archives, which is an absolute treasure trove. So we have there's correspondence in there, there are photographs in there, there are scripts in there are scrapbooks in there. It's so much content, and that is available to view at the British Library if anyone's interested in particular subjects or parts of his career. We also have radio broadcasts, so the BBC content, not all of them, but a lot of them. Sometimes we will have snippets, little pieces that he produced to go into a particular broadcast. Other times we will have the full broadcast, so an off-air recording. But to start at the beginning, Ludwig Koch, being the father of wildlife sound recording, he's credited with making the first recording ever of an animal. In this case, it was his pet Indian Sharma, or white-rumped Sharma. I'm just going to play the recording of the song here. So this was made in 1889 or thereabouts. Taking a quote from Memoirs of a Birdman, Ludwig says, "This bird was the first subject of my recording, and I still cherish the very poor record I made. It was the beginning of my career as a recorder of nature sounds." And sadly, the original cylinder on which he recorded this, his father had bought him an Edison phonograph as a gift, and he used one of the cylinders to record this bird. Sadly, the cylinder has been lost, but luckily a transfer was made onto disc, and it was released somewhere in the 70s on a BBC LP, many BBC LPs dedicated to Ludwig's recordings. And so at least we still get to hear this recording. I think it's pretty hard in itself because it's a good recording considering what he was recording it on. We have his published records, and we have some of them which were published in Germany before he had to leave, and others which were published in the UK, so from 1936 onwards. And he wasn't just interested in birds. That was obviously, birds and wildlife became sort of the main interest and the main focus of his work, but he was also interested in other aspects, all aspects of sound really, non-spoken anyway. He was very interested in the sounds of cities, the sounds of water. The published record in the top left is looking at urban sounds, whereas the one next to it, top right, that's the first audio identification guide, bird guide that was ever published in the UK. So this was published in 1936. He came, I think, in February 1936, and by sort of May, June, you know, he'd already worked on this publication. You know, he'd hit the ground running literally as soon as he turned up. Then we also have underneath it, because Songs of Wild Birds was a bit of an experiment really, and it was so popular, people loved it, that really set off his published record career in the UK. So we have more Songs of Wild Birds. Later on you have the Singing Birds of Larkin, which was published in different 3 different languages, various different kinds of published records, and we're interested not just in the audio in these cases, but also in the packaging, in the way that the records were designed, because that's another interesting aspect of commercial sound recording, commercial wildlife sound recording, but you know, across the board really. So these are just a few examples of his published records. You can hear some of these if you go to our website sounds.bl.uk, go to early wildlife recordings, and these have been digitized. These 4 of the 5 are on there, the wildlife ones, and you can listen to those at home. And this is also on the website, and this is a great one because this is a little bit of a departure, I guess. The other publications are mainly identification guides, you know, but this one was called Animal Language. This is looking at, it's rather a scientific publication. It came with a book and 2 discs, and this looks at how sound is used by animals to communicate, you know. So it's not just an identification guide, because you're probably not going to encounter a fur seal every day, you know, so you're not going to really need to learn, you know, what they sound like. It's not the same as a blackbird or a chaffinch, but it's still really interesting. And I guess it's, you know, it's exotic as well in a way for people in the 1930s to hear these sounds. These are all of captive animals. They were recorded in London Zoo and Whipsnade. I'm going to play, in a minute I'm going to play one of them, but for now I love this quote from Ludwig's autobiography, because any wildlife sound recorders or any sound recorders, particularly of wildlife or events, will sympathise with this. So Ludwig writes, the wolf pack, well actually Ludwig didn't write this, Julian Huxley wrote this, but it describes what happened to poor Ludwig. The wolf pack at Whipsnade can only be described as disobliging. As the head keeper explained, the wolves usually start their concerted howling when they hear a particular siren, which goes at 5 each afternoon. But when the microphone was put in position, the siren failed to elicit any response. The wolves looked towards Mr. Koch, who was standing by it, with a sort of sly defiance, but remained entirely mute. And this is so typical when you're recording wildlife. You know, you set everything up, you push record, and either the bird flies away or the subject of your recording just decides to just be quiet. And so I can fully sympathise, and I think any wildlife sound recordist can also sympathise. So we can't hear the wolves, but what we're going to listen to now are the sounds of a Bactrian camel. So there you go. If you ever need to identify a Bactrian camel, you know what it sounds like. So as I mentioned earlier, we have several hundred recordings or test records from Ludwig. Now what he would do is he would go out in the EMI recording van. There would be an oven in the van. He would heat up his wax discs, make several recordings, bring those back to the studio and press them. That's really tricky business, because if the wax was too soft, you wouldn't get a firm enough groove. If the wax was too hard, you wouldn't get a deep enough groove. So it's really, really difficult to try and get it just right. And as Ludwig says, at that time, recording on wax was undoubtedly the best method. So it was better than a wax cylinder. For my special work, however, it had the disadvantage that I could not play back and listen to the result of my recording. And how often was I disappointed when a half-processed shellac disc was played back? So it must have been really, really difficult, which is why they would take multiple recordings of a subject, get them all pressed. So as you can see here, the number S.971/4. So there would be 1, 2, 3, 4, possibly 5. Get them all pressed, pick the best one, and hope at least one of them is good. And these can also, some of them can be listened to on sounds.bl.uk if you're interested. Now, his autobiography is, as I said, brilliant. This photograph is of Ludwig signing copies at an event in Harrods in 1955, I believe. And just peppered through the book are just the most wonderful descriptions of people that he met and different challenges that he faced. And he has a very poetic way of writing, I find. And this is towards the end of the book. And I just really, really love it. I just find it really, I don't know, very moving, really. So Ludwig writes, "The day of my departure drew near, and I had not achieved my main object, the recording of the flight of the Manx shearwaters. Almost in despair, I landed on Annet again with my gear. At 12:30, the shearwaters began to rise. In great excitement, I started to cut a disc. With even greater expiration, I found the heavy dew was making recording impossible, for the turntable did not move. On top of that, the Manx shearwaters kept on flying towards my recording gear, almost touching it, and around my feet and close to my face. I had to use my hands and handkerchief to chase them away, at the same time frantically working to dry the gear. At 1:15, I heard through the headphones at last that my discs were recording clearly the fantastic natural symphony of the flight of the shearwaters, a sound which still echoes in my ears, which few have heard and which no one else has ever succeeded in recording." And there's so much pride in that that statement as well. And if you imagine his voice telling you the story, you know, you can really picture it. And it's just a great example of how frustrating it can be, but how if you persevere, you can succeed in your recording ambitions. So if you ever get a chance to get this autobiography or read it, just do it, because it's so interesting. Now, his personal archives are so rich as well. And these are a couple of examples that I pulled out the other day. These are 2 scrapbooks that we have, and they include newspaper cuttings, German newspaper cuttings. So ones you would have collected. This, I think he started collecting in 1931, and it goes all the way up to, I think there may be some at the back which are English, but the ones I was going through yesterday, they were all German, and they all refer to either events that he did, or some French ones in there as well, events that he did, publications, anything to show what he was doing. So, you know, he obviously had a lot of pride in what he was doing, and it's really interesting. Well, I can't read them because I don't read German, but if you do read German, they're very, very interesting, and they are quite telling at times, you know, about his early work. And this has all been catalogued as well, and you can come into the library, book an appointment if you have something in particular that you want to find out, and go through the archives. Now, radio broadcasts. This, for me, what I'm going to play in a minute is something that has stayed with me ever since I heard this. Now, as I said, Ludwig was very interested in all kinds of sound, but he was very aware of the power of sound and how it can make you feel, and how important sound is as well. In 1940s, early 1940s, he wrote a letter to the Times saying that, you know, it's such a terrible time in the UK. There were bombs falling everywhere. You know, they're in the middle of a war, and he was saying to people, just, if you can, just try and stop for a minute and just try and listen to the sounds of nature, and soak up all the well-being that comes from that. So he was very ahead of of his time in terms of understanding nature and well-being and mental health, you know, which you think it's more of a modern thing, but he was talking about this, writing about it in the 40s and 50s. And there was a program that he did in, it was aired initially in 1951 called Music of the Sea. It's quite an experimental piece, quite a, it was a montage of different kinds of sounds. But in the beginning, the run up to it, he introduces it, and I'm going to play it now. And he just speaks about how important it is to just stop and just listen to sounds. You know, just don't be distracted. Don't listen to sounds as like an add-on or a background, but just give your full attention to sound, because there are so many benefits that come along with this. So I'm just going to play this now for you.
This evening in archives continues now with Music of the Sea, a sound picture without words, introduced by Ludwig Koch.
Throughout the ages, the eye of mankind has always been kept in training. We are able to look at the works that painters and sculptors did centuries ago, but sound has never been preserved for us. The Chinese have an old story that a Chinese emperor 6,000 years ago sent a secret message to one of his generals many thousand miles away by uttering the words into a sealed tube. And when the tube was opened, the words were audible. We don't know this technique, but the story does show that an interest in canned sound is nothing new. In spite of the inventions, which started in 1877 with Edison, I noticed that very few people really listen, either to the radio or to natural sounds, or even to beautiful mechanical sounds out of doors, such as church bells or carillons. Most people still use their radio as a background to daily work and conversation. One may perhaps attract them a little closer to the radio with, say, a beautiful voice or music. But in these programs, I want you to try to listen to sound alone, without the help of words or man-made music. I have chosen Music of the Sea as a first program because I think it should appeal to everybody living on these islands. I want you to concentrate only for a quarter of an hour. Close your eyes. Don't fall asleep. Simply listen.
So I find that just so lovely. And I'm just going to play an excerpt from the program Music of the Sea and launch a little slideshow, I guess, of photographs from Ludwig's archive. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you found that interesting. I hope it gave you some insight into the material that we have at the British Library that relates to Ludwig Koch, and just really what a remarkable man he was, and how we have so much to thank him for in the wildlife sound recording community. So I'm going to stop the share. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to email me, cheryl.tipp@bl.uk, and I'll be very happy to answer your questions. But for now, thanks again. Hope you continue to have a wonderful evening, and take care. Bye.
So I'm very pleased to announce that the next MeCCSA Sound Studies Network event takes place on Thursday, the 28th of October. And again, it's in the 7 to 8:30 evening slot, when our speakers will be the musician, performer and sound artist Isabel Anderson, and the composer, musician and field recordist Tullis Rennie. And they're going to be talking about new directions in field recording and some of the groundbreaking work that they've done around self-reflexive narratives in field recording. So I hope some of you will be able to join us then. Now, if you'd like to know more about any forthcoming events organised by the network and how to get involved in the network, please do sign up to our mailing list. There's a link in the Eventbrite reminders that you've got, but again, in a moment, I'll pop it into the chat for you. This team's meeting is going to be open until 9 o'clock. So if anyone wants to hang out for a chat, please feel free to do so. But otherwise, I'd like again to thank Anthea, John and Cheryl, and also Philippa for running the session with me tonight. And thank you for joining us this evening. And from the MeCCSA Sound Studies Network, thanks very much and goodbye.